Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today, I'll be responding to Redeem Zoomer's quickfire response to all the arguments he hears from atheists. Usually, he focuses on issues between Christian denominations on his channel, but this video caught my attention. Since it covers so many arguments, it may not give us a chance to dig deep into them, but it is a great way to get an overview of the conversation. The goal of this video is to pick out which arguments I'd encourage other atheists to put aside and which arguments I think are worth delving into to spotlight actual problems with Christianity. I'll save the good stuff for last, so let's start with some of the bad arguments that wouldn't have convinced me back when I was a believer.
Religion causes wars.
I would never use this argument to conclude religion must be false. Maybe it's the false religions causing wars, or the true religion has a just war to wage. I guess there's an issue if a supposedly peaceful religion causes its followers to wage unprovoked wars, but that would only apply to a few particular denominations. To be fair, this would include many of the larger and more powerful denominations, but still not Christianity as a whole.
Well, actually, only 7% of all human wars were caused by religion, and if you remove Islamic wars, that number drops down to 3%.
Sure, and those wars have reasons that go far deeper than simply which religions are common amongst those who fight. They've been about territory and access to resources, about fear of outsiders and greed for wealth. They've been about power and control, and often on the other side of these things, they've been about protecting homelands and loved ones. Maybe we'd expect the true God to raise his believers above this violence, but there are 1,000 theodicies that could explain why he wouldn't.
A lot of evil has been done in the name of religion. This is true, but the most murderous people in human history have been atheists. This doesn't mean religion is true, it just means you can't use that as an argument against it.
Absolutely agreed. Atheists can't point to murderous theists, nor can theists point to murderous atheists, as a critique of anything more than those particular individuals. Any group will have its poor representatives and people who misuse it, and pointing to those people ought not condemn the group as a whole.
Jesus never claimed to be God.
Honestly, who cares about this one? This is an internal question for Christians, not one I have as an atheist. I'm interested in whether or not Jesus is God. If his claim is part of the evidence, fine, present that, but it doesn't have to be. God would be wholly capable of choosing not to reveal himself, so I don't see how pointing out that Jesus never claimed to be God means that he wasn't God.
The later one of the Gospels was written, the more divine it makes Jesus seem, so we can extrapolate that Jesus was originally a human figure who got made more divine over time. Alright, maybe some Gospels emphasize Jesus' divinity more than others, but what about Paul's letters that fully confess the divinity of Jesus and were also written before any of the Gospels, so that breaks your pattern.
I'm not really a historian or sociologist, so this is getting outside the points I would try to make. If I did try to make this argument, I might explain away the difference in Paul's theology as a remnant of his Gentile roots, giving him a more divine conception of Jesus, a conception that took time to spread to the rest of Christian thinkers. But on the other hand, Zoomer can say that it's because the divinity of Christ was revealed to Paul while others were still figuring it out. At the end of the day, this seems like one of those things that either side can explain and isn't really good evidence one way or the other.
The story of Jesus was copied from the story of Horus or some other ancient character. Okay, dude, that's a Reddit atheist level myth. Even atheist scholars know that that's silly.
Again, I don't know enough about ancient mythology to say whether this is a good or a bad argument. Maybe there's something to it, but because of my lack of knowledge on the subject, I wouldn't use it.
Constantine invented what we now know of as Christianity. Again, Reddit atheist level myth. Atheists can do better than that. Listen to an actual scholar.
At best, this is one small example of Christianity spreading through mundane means when it could have spread miraculously, but beyond that broader point, it's pretty weak. Ultimately, how it spread is much more nuanced than it boiling down to the approval of a single person. So even if Constantine's approval was a key step, I don't see how that's contradictory to the claims of Christianity.
Atheist countries are more prosperous. Yes, it's true that Northern European countries are very prosperous and very secular, but correlation doesn't equal causation. It's not like atheism causes prosperity, it's that prosperity causes atheism because when people have comfortable lives, they don't feel a need to depend on God.
How did Zoomer make such a great point about how correlation doesn't equal causation, and then immediately throw that point out to say that prosperity does cause atheism? He even gave a nice ad hoc rationalization to justify it, even though he just said that such a conclusion shouldn't be drawn.
But why are these particular countries so prosperous in the first place? They may be secular now, but they're rooted in generations and generations of Protestant Christianity. If you want an example of a country that's atheist and not rooted in Christianity, look at communist China.
Yeah, look at communist China, the global superpower that's been atheistic for generations. Those guys aren't prospering at all right now, what with their advanced green energy tech and rising standards of living. Yeah, that'll show that prosperity only correlates with countries that have historically been Christian, proving that Christianity caused prosperity. Yeah, that's a strong argument. Do you think Zoomer ever reflects on what he puts into these videos or just barfs up the first rebuttal that springs to mind? This was such a poor response for what should have been a very weak argument for atheism.
Science disproves God. Well, actually, the church invented modern science. All the founders of the scientific revolution deeply believed in God, and medieval theologians laid the groundwork for modern science by saying the world was governed by an intelligent creator. That means we can understand the world with our intelligence. And studying God led to studying the world because the world is God's creation.
Why are we talking about the founders of science? They taught us how to do science, but they didn't have all the answers yet. And the scientific process itself can be understood under both atheism and theism, so it's another of those irrelevant things for either side to bring up as an argument.
Psychology explains why you believe in God. So what? If God is real, we should expect there to be some psychological or social benefit to believing in him.
I'm honestly not even sure what this argument is trying to get at. There are natural explanations for belief, so there can't be supernatural ones? I'm not sure, but I'm happy to agree with Zoomer that it's a bad argument.
Spiritual experiences can be explained by brain chemicals. Well, romantic experiences can also be explained by brain chemicals, but that doesn't mean your wife isn't real. So spiritual experiences being explained by brain chemicals doesn't mean that God isn't real.
If those brain chemicals are being moved around your brain supernaturally for God to communicate with you, then sure, brain chemicals being involved with supernatural experiences seems perfectly coherent. Of course, if the chemicals move around through purely natural processes, it'd also be perfectly coherent with atheism. We don't know much about the brain and how these chemicals are moving, so while we're waiting on science to teach us more about the subject, it seems like once again this is just another of those arguments that can't really be used for either side.
Well, drug trips show that spiritual experiences are from the brain. Well, people who have had both drug trips and near-death experiences say that they're completely different categories of feeling.
Everything we know about subjective experiences, including drug trips, shows the physical brain to be at least a key component. All Zoomer has to do here is point out that even so, that doesn't rule out supernatural sources for at least some experiences. Drug trips can come from chemical interactions with the physical brain, but that doesn't logically preclude God from revealing prophecies. Maybe that's what Zoomer's trying to get at with the near death experiences, but them being subjectively different from drug trips isn't evidence of the supernatural. All of my experiences are different from each other, but that doesn't mean that any of those experiences has to have a supernatural source. Zoomer could have at least brought up people knowing things they shouldn't have as evidence of NDEs, and then I'd have to point out the unverified nature of these stories and their mutually contradictory conclusions they generate. But no, all we get is a very weak rebuttal to what wasn't even a good argument in the first place.
You really think God made billions of galaxies with billions of stars in each of them just to have a personal relationship with you? Yes.
Maybe if those other stars turn out to have alien civilizations, I'd have some questions for Christians, but as it stands, I have no problems with this answer. Maybe creating the stars and galaxies and universe as a whole barely even registered God's interest, and he only cares about intelligent life like us. Making the heavens is an artwork for us to demonstrate his power seems perfectly in line with Christian thought. Tempting though it is to make this into an example of Christianity's self-centered nature, it's just not a fair internal critique.
Religion is just wishful thinking. Well, if that were true, then the Bible wouldn't be all about how much we all suck.
This one's more of a conclusion than an argument. I never bring it up in the hopes of sparking doubt in a believer. But I don't see how the Bible being about how we all suck is evidence against it being wishful thinking. Let's not forget it's also about how we can have eternal life in Christ in spite of how much we all suck. Human psychology is wonderfully complex, and the way stories and beliefs spread through cultures is far from simple. To say that anything which stemmed from wishful thinking could never view humans as such crap is so reductive it borders on willfully ignorant.
Can God make a rock he can't lift? Well, you're just asking if God can contradict himself, like can God lie, or can God change, or can God make another God? And the answer to all those things is no. God being all-powerful means he can do anything to things outside himself. It doesn't mean that he can do anything to himself, or that he can contradict himself.
To me, this argument isn't about disproving God, it's about understanding what all powerful means. It means doing anything which can be done, not anything at all, not self contradictory things. It means that God can make any rock and move any rock, but not that rocks can be made to overcome God, not even if God himself makes the rocks. Go ahead and use this argument if you're talking to someone who does think God can create self contradictions, but in my experience, this is pretty rare.
If God is good, why can't he destroy all evil? Well, he eventually will.
Sure, maybe he will. Maybe he'll make reparations for the evil he allowed. Maybe something in God's plan for us necessitates evil now for a more ultimate victory later. This question might make a believer ponder their God and why he allows evil, but I don't expect it to lead them to the conclusion that actually God isn't good.
Why can't he do it now? because he'd have to destroy you.
Sure, we're all on a spiritual journey and we have to make mistakes along the way. Zoomer doesn't need to make his answer so threatening, but whatever. I'd rather just get to some more interesting points.
Why does God let any bad things happen? Because we deserve it.
Do we, though? I'm still of the opinion that this line of reasoning with the problem of evil is quite weak, but so is Zoomer's answer. If God created all, he gets the credit for all the good, but also all the blame for all the bad. Don't blame the imperfect creation while calling the creator perfect. Just say the bad things are part of God's plan, part of the trial by fire to make us the godly creatures he wants us to be. Own up to God's sovereign allowance to let bad things happen.
Well, animals don't sin, so why do they suffer? Well, the Bible says all things will be restored, so if God is good, we can assume that they will be compensated.
Sure, why not? It's not like animals have the same issues with judgment to get to heaven that we humans should have. Maybe we've got souls and free will and animals don't, so we have to pass judgment while they can just automatically get in. Maybe the animal suffering in this world is a natural consequence of God stepping back and using evolution as his method to bring forth intelligent life. This line of the problem of evil is good, it'll make you think, but I don't think it quite gets you to a contradiction between a good God and the world we live in.
Why did God let evil exist at all? So he could be glorified in defeating it. Triumph over evil is a greater good than evil having just never existed.
I've got my own theodicies I think would work to explain this, mainly around putting us in a challenging world so we can be judged on the fullness of our lives. I don't particularly like Zoomer's version, but honestly, it seems so pointless to argue. I'll post a link here if you want my full thoughts on the problem of evil, but in short, I think you need to look at the scriptural details if you want anything to stick. Just comparing God's philosophical nature with the evil in the world doesn't get you anywhere.
Christianity only spread because of military conquest. Well, eventually they did do military conquest, but for the first 300 years of Christianity, it was illegal, and it took over the Roman Empire despite that.
But making a thing illegal does not prevent it from becoming popular. Oftentimes it has the opposite effect, making people crave even more that which they aren't allowed to have. Or they feel like the authorities have something to hide and they want to reveal the truth. Christianity's popularity was not in spite of Roman oppression, it was perfectly in line with it. But there's a broader point to this argument that Zoomer's response completely misses. Why should Christianity, or any true religion, need to spread the same way through word of mouth as any false religion? Why not have simultaneous revelations across the globe? Maybe there are still select prophets performing miracles, and the belief has to spread through the population. But imagine if the European Christian missionaries had met the Chinese Christian missionaries coming the other way down the Silk Road, and they realized they believed the same thing. And then in 1492 they learned of the existence of the American Christians and realized they all have the same path to salvation. How incredible would that have been to have three different stories with entirely different characters, but all given the same hope of salvation by the same God long before any of them even knew of each other's existence? We could have had a miraculous spread that was itself evidence for the belief. But no, we get military conquest and other mundane human methods of spreading the message. I don't think this gets you to atheism, but at the least one has to recognize that God passed up an incredible opportunity to provide us evidence.
There's no scientific proof that God exists. Well, by definition, science can only prove things inside the natural world, and by definition, God is something outside the natural world, so science can neither prove nor disprove God.
I think this is a great point for agnostics. It just isn't enough to get you to certain atheism. God may be outside the natural world, but he is still capable of reaching in and interacting with the natural world, and that is something we should be able to scientifically measure. Maybe science can't disprove God, but it could certainly prove him if he played along and provided plenty of evidence. Too bad he doesn't seem willing to do that.
There's no evidence of anything supernatural. Well, that's just not accurate. There are medically documented cases of people with demonic possession speaking in languages they don't know, for example, and people with near-death experiences getting information they never had access to.
Same as the last point. This is great to say in defense of not believing in anything supernatural, but it shouldn't make you say that the supernatural can't exist. If the supernatural does exist, I wouldn't expect that it has to present evidence of itself to us. On the other hand, there isn't any evidence in favor that we should believe it either. Near-death experiences correlate strongly with cultural beliefs, so while a Christian may talk to Jesus, a Hindu may speak with Vishnu. If there is a next life, the fact that we see such divergent claims about it seems unexpected. As for demonic possession, natural causes like mental illness are never truly ruled out, and no amount of nonsensical babbling will ever be evidence for the supernatural.
There's no evidence for Jesus outside the Bible. Well, that's not true. There's the ancient Jewish historian Josephus who wrote about Jesus, and he's one of the reasons why even secular scholars know Jesus historically existed.
Josephus proves only that people seem to genuinely believe the claim they made about Jesus having appeared after his death. You can also watch a news anchor interview audience members today as they leave a magic show, and despite the open secret that it's just a trick, some people sure seem to believe they just saw magic. But the interviewer's record of the audience is no more evidence for the magic than the claims coming from the audience members themselves. In the same way, Josephus's record of the claims the believers made is no more evidence for them than the claims themselves. As far as there being any evidence outside the Bible that can independently verify that Jesus performed miracles, we have nothing.
Evolution proves God didn't create the world. Well, not necessarily. God often works through natural processes in the Bible, and for all of church history, there have been prominent Christian theologians who have had a more metaphorical interpretation of Genesis, even well over 1,000 years before Darwin existed.
Evolution is compatible with a metaphorical understanding of biblical creation, but conceding that Genesis isn't literal undercuts everything from the Sabbath to original sin. Why do we act as God did, resting on the seventh day, if God created the world through natural processes over billions of years? What does the seventh day even refer to? And how did original sin enter the world? Without a literal Adam and Eve, who ate the fruit? How did we disobey God to let in sin? Yes, God could have used evolution as his method of choice, and so it can't be used to prove that he didn't create the world. But where does that leave his scriptures when we can't rely on them for literal truth?
If you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be a Christian. Okay, and if you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be an atheist. Everyone's beliefs are shaped by their context.
I agree with Zoomer that we cannot say someone's belief is wrong just because it aligns to what was popular in their community. It is equally as fallacious to accept the belief as true just because everyone around you believes it, as it is to label someone else's belief as false just because they were born into it. Ultimately, the popularity is irrelevant, and what matters is the evidence. But I think there is another level to this argument that Zoomer may be missing. Under theism, God could miraculously reveal himself to selected individuals around the globe, and we would see beliefs that stand out as unique from their context. But under atheism, we would expect that the culture one is raised in should be one of the primary determining factors for one's belief. I don't think this is strong enough to be proof, but it is evidence that aligns with atheism better than theism. I think it's also worth noting that on a personal level, Zoomer's response falls particularly flat. I wasn't raised as an atheist. Maybe I at least needed to be born somewhere where I could get a good education, but I think it's quite likely I could have rejected any other belief system just as I did Christianity to arrive where I am now. There's no way to know for sure, but I think it's unfair of Zoomer to completely write off the possibility and reduce my current atheism to my particular upbringing. He has no right to say that I wouldn't be an atheist if I were merely born elsewhere.
There's 4,000 gods that people believe in, and you're atheist to 3,999 of them. I just go one god further. Okay, this isn't the gotcha that you think it is, because the question of whether some sort of God exists is fundamentally different from the question of which religion is right about God.
Except nobody thinks this is a gotcha. It's only worth bringing up if a believer asks an agnostic why they don't believe in a God. It's a reminder that they owe no more explanation for their lack of belief in gods they've never seen than the believer does for any of the gods they've never considered. If the conversation is going to go anywhere, the believer has to realize that they are the ones making the claim that a particular God exists, or even just that some God exists, and so they bear the burden of proof. And if a strong atheist comes along who disbelieves in any possible God, who claims God does not exist, then of course they have a burden of proof too. But an agnostic who merely lacks belief in God does not.
How do you know which religion is true? Well, everyone, religious or not, has faith in a certain worldview. It's just that some worldviews are called religions and some are secular. But everyone has to ask the question of which worldview best explains the world.
This isn't an argument so much as a fair question. To actually give a straight answer, I think we need to use evidence and reasoning to the best of our abilities, trying to maximize explanatory power while avoiding self-contradictions. I hope Zoomer would at least agree on this broad point, even if we disagree on where the reasoning leads. But I am a little disappointed that he just turns his response into "no you" to point out that everyone ought to be able to defend their beliefs. Why this deflection? Why not just summarize the standards he uses to conclude Christianity's truth?
If Christianity is true, why are there so many denominations of it? Well, yeah, there are a lot of denominations, but the things they agree on are a lot more significant than the things they disagree on.
Zoomer puts up on screen are all the things that every true Christian everywhere agrees on. But speaking from my own experience, the church I was raised in would deny two of these statements. They deny the Trinity and say that Jesus is the Son of God, but isn't himself God, literally the top two things on the list. What does that mean when there is disagreement on even the most significant things? Why are there such prominent disagreements stemming from the same source text when that text claims to be a clear and unconfusing source of teaching?
How do you know that God isn't evil instead? Well, because evil is not a thing the way good is. Just like cold is just a lack of heat, and dark is just a lack of light, evil is just a lack of good. And for good to be objective, it needs to come from God. So a God who is objectively evil is logically impossible.
It's just as valid to say evil is a lack of good as it is to say that good is a lack of evil. Why not say that good isn't really a thing the way evil is, which is sourced from an all-evil God? There's nothing to break the symmetry and make it one of these things over the other, so it makes much more sense to just view good and evil as polar opposites rather than a lack of one another. Evil is suffering and good is well-being, and a neutral possibility is left open in the middle for things which neither cause suffering nor bring well-being. And even if good is sourced from God, how do you know that in God's goodness He's not going to put you into a car accident this evening? When you just define good as being in accordance to God's will, but sometimes His will allows horrible things to happen, you can get out of explaining why He isn't evil, but at the cost of having to redefine what good and evil even are. Is it evil for a child's cancer to be cured? Is it good for a school to be bombed? If it's God's will for the children to die, then yeah. Maybe you can define away an evil God by defining goodness to be what God wills, but then the meaning of good and evil get flipped on their heads.
God is just used to fill in the gaps of things that science can't explain yet. Well, actually, God is the reason for everything, even things that science can explain. It's not one or the other. It's not like everything's explained by either science or God, and the more science can explain, the less God can explain. Really, science can explain almost everything, but God is still behind it all, because science explains the how, and God explains the why.
But it doesn't even solve the why, because as part of God's uncaused nature, it concedes that there is no why to God's existence. At least I admit that there's no problem in not knowing why the universe exists. Christianity says it is a problem not to know this and fills the gap with God. But then when you ask why God exists, suddenly that gap isn't so problematic. And don't you know God is the uncaused cause? He doesn't need a why. The double standards are infuriating. Once you learn to see it, the irony is so clear. Zoomer is trying to refute the idea that God is used to fill in the gaps science can't fill in. Of course, science can't explain its own ability to explain things, so when Zoomer's like, yeah, God's the one behind it all, God explains why science can explain things, he's quite literally demonstrating the God of the gaps thinking that he's claiming not to use. The lack of awareness is astonishing.
Faith is the opposite of logic and reason. No, it's not. Faith just means trust. Anytime you eat food, you're having faith that it's not poisoned, even if you can't scientifically prove it. If you're married, you have faith that your wife loves you, even if you can't scientifically prove that. And if you tried to scientifically prove it, she'd probably get very mad at you because it would mean you didn't trust her.
If I'm suspicious that the food is poisoned, I can test it. I can feed a morsel to a mouse and see if it keels over. With my wife's love, even if I shouldn't test it, there should still be evidence. The memories we've built and the little moments where we express our affections. If the trust is built on reason and evidence, that's great. So where is that for God? Where is that for the miracles claimed in the Bible? All we have are claims of eyewitness testimony, a form of evidence so weak that I cannot use it to justify a belief in the supernatural. There are so many possibilities for the apostles to genuinely believe in something which didn't happen, so many nuances of human psychology and bias. Too many for me to think that they couldn't have been wrong in their beliefs in the resurrection and all the rest. If you can show that the faith you're using is the kind based on reason and evidence, that's great, but I simply don't know any Christians who can do that. I don't care how much you twist the meaning of the words. Faith in miracles based simply on the gospel account is devoid of logic and reason.
The Gospels were anonymous. Okay, anonymous doesn't mean we have no idea who wrote them. It just means the names of the authors aren't signed in the text itself. But we literally have writings from church fathers who knew the apostles and can verify that they indeed wrote the books named after them.
To me, this argument is pointing at two problems. One, we don't know if the authors were eyewitnesses or merely relaying tales from supposed eyewitnesses. Two, even granting that they were eyewitnesses, that kind of testimony is wholly insufficient to be considered evidence for the supernatural. We've all seen magic tricks where the whole audience gets fooled, so it isn't a sign that the natural order was suspended just because some people think they saw a miracle. But Zoomer's response brings up a third problem, which is that instead of some kind of direct verification that these were eyewitness accounts of the apostles, we only have the testimony of the church fathers that these came from the apostles. The church fathers, who couldn't have been biased and had absolutely nothing to gain from the message, said that they can vouch for the authenticity of the accounts. This religion is built on a foundation of sand and mud.
The Gospels misquote Jesus. Now, it's true that a lot of secular scholars think the Gospels are a mix of real quotes from the historical Jesus and fake quotes added by the church, but none of them can agree on which quotes are legit and which are not, so we can discard their opinions.
Scholars can't tell which ones are legit or not, so we should just accept every quote in the Gospels as legit? That doesn't stand up to any scrutiny. Imagine a pin code reader that couldn't tell half the buttons you press. Maybe they're correct, maybe they're not, so it just assumes that they're right. That doesn't sound very secure. The lack of agreement on this topic doesn't mean we get to discard scholarly opinion. It means we should be more cautious of taking the Gospels as literal truth, and our trust in the most extraordinary claims of miracles should be the first to come crumbling down. There may still be kernels of truth in the stories of Jesus' life and teachings, but the supernatural claims about him seem much less likely if even our earliest records show people adding bits and pieces to the stories that came before.
The Bible supports slavery. No, it doesn't. Just because there's slavery in the Bible doesn't mean the Bible supports it. There are some Old Testament verses that could be interpreted as condoning slavery, but Jesus himself said that the Old Testament made accommodations to people's sinful state.
Let me correct that. There are some New Testament verses that could be interpreted as condemning slavery, but God himself explicitly commanded it. In Leviticus 25:44 to 46, God condones slavery. Later, Jesus talks about loving one another and treating your slaves well, but he never outright condemns it. The only kind of slavery that is condemned is enslaving your own people. Coming from a God who is supposed to be the moral guide for all of humanity, it's a problem. It means he's only developed to a morality of us versus them, which is inexcusably small-minded.
And also, slave owners in the American South had slave Bibles for their slaves to read, but it omitted a lot of the real Bible, so if the Bible actually did support slavery, this wouldn't have been necessary.
But the slave Bible wasn't written until 1807, with the slave trade having long been going strong, and even then it was only used in the British West Indies, not mainland America. It wasn't necessary. It was one attempt by one group of Christians to make their slaves more obedient. Just because they omitted some parts of the Bible doesn't mean those parts condemn slavery. For example, the Exodus account could be taken to mean that everyone should be freed, but in context, it's clearly only God's chosen people who matter. The slave Bible didn't omit the parts that condemn slavery, it omitted the parts that didn't outright condone it. So ultimately, the problem this presents is that with most books, when you omit the parts that fail to condone slavery, you're left with no book at all. But with the Bible, you're still left with more than 200 chapters, some of which, to be fair, were just building the general story on which the other chapters actually condone slavery. But if the Bible doesn't condone slavery, what's with all those chapters, especially the ones that sure sound like they explicitly do?
Christianity supported slavery. Well, sure, some Christians did, but all human civilizations have had slavery. Christian civilization was the first one to abolish it on moral grounds. The fact that you're against slavery is due to Christian influence. Also, most organizations fighting modern-day slavery are Christian.
The fact that I'm against slavery is due to the influence of humanism, in spite of Christianity. You don't get to say that Christianity inspired the abolition of slavery when Christians were on both sides and slavery went unabolished during more than 1,000 years of Christian cultural domination. And congrats to the Christian anti-slavery organizations, they're doing good work, but they may be more influenced by Enlightenment values than biblical ones.
God killed tons of people in the Bible. Well, it's actually way more than that. God numbers everyone's days. He's the giver of life, so he can take it, especially if people sin.
Even granting this is true, killing children who were too young to have sinned really goes against the free will and judgment theodicies that I think are necessary to solve the problem of evil. Maybe reincarnation and giving those kids' souls another chance could save it, but that's not biblical. Biblical is original sin, which does not help the problem and in fact ruins the free will theodicy. So the murderous behavior of Yahweh in the Old Testament seems pretty contrary to his claimed all good nature, especially when he does things like flood the entire planet or command entire tribes to be wiped out.
The Bible has contradictions. Okay, you think you found an apparent contradiction that the church hasn't known about for 2,000 years? Every apparent contradiction can be explained by understanding just a little bit of theology.
It sounds like Zoomer is agreeing that there are at least what appear to be contradictory passages in the Bible, but if you understand the context and the nuance, the apparent contradictions can be answered. And this can save the belief in some cases. You want to take the different genealogies of Jesus and say one is Mary's line and the other is Joseph's? Fine. But what about when John says Jesus carried his own cross, while Matthew, Mark, and Luke say that Simon carried it? Which gospel account is wrong? Both passages say they carried it to Golgotha, so it's not like one of them carried it to the edge of town and then switched it off for the other one. Did they both carry it? That wasn't how the Romans punished criminals. The Roman way was one criminal per burden. They weren't sharing the burdens. There wouldn't have been two people carrying it. At the end of the day, there's no getting around the fact that at least one of the passages has to be misleading at best and outright wrong at worst. And either of those makes the claim of divine inspiration pretty shaky.
If God created everything, then who created God? Well, God is defined as the uncaused causer. Everyone knows there needs to be a first cause at the beginning of the chain of all events in the universe, and it makes a lot more sense for that first cause to be a personal God who caused things for a reason, rather than some random impersonal force.
Another lazy explanation. Everyone knows? Seriously? It's not like a first cause is literally the only option. There could also be an infinite regress or circular causality. Zoomer could at least try to justify this claim, but no, everyone knows there needs to be a first cause. But whatever, I'm willing to grant something similar at least, that there is a necessary being, which must be uncaused. This being could be a first cause, or whatever extended into past eternity, or even the entire loop of time itself, depending on how causality plays out through time. Personally, I think the past eternity option is the most likely, and the universe in its entirety is this necessary being. But regardless, if something has to be uncaused, personality seems like the last trait it would have. By definition, an uncaused personal being would have no reasons behind its character traits, nothing at all leading to its moral judgments and knowledge of possible realities. I think it makes far more sense for an uncaused being to be impersonal, and there's no need for a personal God at all. I also want to point out that Zoomer really turns up his annoying atheist voice for this question. I think that asking him who made God strikes a nerve, because he knows that he doesn't have a satisfying answer, only arbitrary ad hoc special pleadings to pretend that Yahweh must be the uncaused cause, but the universe itself can't be. This is the deepest crack I know of in theology, and if you follow it down, you'll find that God can't exist, because if he did, he would be a solipsist, and there is no grounding whatsoever for his personality, his goodness, or his intelligence. Now seems as good a time as any to plug my video going into this argument if you haven't seen it already. And if you don't want to go watch that, then at least go read a fucking book.